This is John Allen, the editor of Crux. Welcome to another exclusive video feature on the Crux website, Crux YouTube page. Here at Crux, of course, our stock and trade is covering the Vatican, and this fall we've got a big event coming up in October. It is the Synod for the Amazon. Pope Francis is, of course, history's first pope from Latin America. The Amazon is a region of the world near and dear to his heart, so this is a much anticipated event. One of the issues we expect to be very much in the air during that Synod is the issue of the viri probati, the idea of ordaining to the priesthood tested married men, which will in turn raise the entire question of clerical celibacy. And so as part of the preparation for that, and just because he's a cool dude, we reached out today to an expert on the conversation around clerical celibacy in the Catholic Church. We are honored to be joined by Father Carter Griffin. Father Carter is the rector of the St. John Paul II Seminary. He is a graduate of Princeton University. He is also a former frontline officer in the United States Navy. So if you hear anchors away at some point during the course of this conversation, that's why. Father Carter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, John, for having me. It's a great honor to be with you.
Now, one of the odd things about the Catholic priesthood is that we always call our priest father. I just introduced you as Father Carter Griffin, and Catholics from day one, know that's how you refer to a priest, Father Steve, Father Joe, Father whoever. And yet, at least in the Latin Rite Church, that is the experience of the Catholic Church with which most people in the United States would be familiar. The priests they're calling father are actually celibate. They've never had children. So what sense does it make to call a celibate male father?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, it was sort of the beginning of my own interest in this whole field. I'm a convert myself, as you might have mentioned in the introduction there. And so I didn't grow up with that experience. And so as later in my life, when I was in college, I started to encounter priests and encounter Catholics. And the same question emerged in my mind, like, why am I calling this man who has no children father? And of course, it didn't take a great leap of imagination to realize that I was his son. I was his child as I was speaking to him. And what I wanted to do with this book that I recently wrote on celibacy is just to sort of say how in fact is that the case. And one of the very interesting conclusions that I found is that in fact I think the spiritual fatherhood that we attribute to priests is actually something that needs to be more widely attributed. That actually every Christian man is called to spiritual fatherhood in one form or another. Every Christian woman is called to spiritual motherhood. And I think that this could be sort of a lens or kind of a wedge issue that can help us, and a wedge in a good sense, that can help us unpack and open up some very interesting conversations about what we can also learn about Christian fatherhood. That every man is his first responsibility, his most important responsibility with his own children is to help them get to heaven. And it's that kind of fatherhood that I think the Catholic priest, a celibate Catholic priest, focuses on.
I should have mentioned at the top that Father Carter, in addition to all the other accolades that I mentioned that are part of his CV, is also the author of Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. It is a new book from Emmaus Road Publishing, and obviously, Father, this is something you've been thinking about for a while. Probably better than virtually anybody, the whole idea of priestly celibacy has come in for a beating in recent years. Some think that celibacy is at the root of the clerical sexual abuse crisis, or is at least a contributing factor. I mean, the argument that if priests could express their sexuality in the normal way that other people do, then they wouldn't be inclined to abuse children. It also is sometimes criticized as a contributing factor to priest shortages around the world. And the Synod for the Amazon is a great example of that, right? Because in the United States, we often complain about priest shortages, but the truth is, compared to other parts of the world, we are priest rich. In the United States, there's a ratio of one priest every 1,300 baptized Catholics. In Latin America as a whole, it's 1 to 7,800. In some regions of the Amazon, it can go as high as 1 to 20,000. And so there, you have people arguing that, well, if we didn't require celibacy, we would have more priests. So in light of those two critiques, what is the defense? What is the argument, I guess I'm asking you, for celibacy as the routine expectation for priests, at least in the Latin Rite?
Yeah, so I think kind of taking that apart a little bit. First of all, looking at maybe the negative side of it, how does one respond to those concerns? The sex abuse kind of issue, I think, is increasingly understood to be not really a rational kind of approach to that. I mean, the fact is that there are many people who are not married, who are not sex abusers. There are many people who are married who unfortunately are. And, I mean, the issue there is not celibacy marriage. The issue there is fidelity. And we need to hold priests accountable just like we hold anyone else accountable to the promises that they make. I think the only reason, frankly, that is even brought up is because I think for many people, kind of in this, what I believe is a fairly confused age about the human person and about human sexuality, is that many people in this post-sexual revolutionary era actually believe that sex is a kind of psychic or spiritual need, that without this you are a stunted human being. And that is something that I believe is just scientifically absolutely untenable. I find it personally untenable. I know many happy people, priests and non-priests, who are not married, who are wonderfully balanced, mature people. So the question of that, why that emerges and whether it holds any water or not, I think is fairly easily set aside. I think the issue of the shortage is a more serious concern. And I acknowledge fully that, it might be, no one knows. I mean, no one knows either side of the question, that if we were to open up the priesthood routinely to married men or have optional celibacy or whatever it would look like, that there might be an increase in vocations, at least in the short term. I don't think that we should take that for granted. There are many Protestant denominations that have married clergy and all kinds of, and who are also struggling to find enough ministers. So I think that there's, I think that's not necessarily a done deal, but what I would point out is, and by the way, the book and some of these things we're talking about are not necessarily specifically about what the Amazon Synod is going to be discussing. I realize that there are some nuances there. They're even saying that we're not talking about viri probati. We're just talking about this isolated case. Viri probati is kind of a larger contextual issue of marrying, proven men who are ordaining proven men who are married, and this is even a narrower band than that. So I don't want to get into the details necessarily of that. I don't consider myself an expert in those details, but I would say that in the more general sense, when we're talking about optional celibacy, not only is it an open question as to whether it would actually increase the numbers that greatly, but the part that I would like to contribute is to say that what would we lose? What would we lose by making celibacy optional? Because I believe that there is a real positive good, a beautiful good. Our Lord spoke about, those who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. St. Paul was a celibate, John the Baptist. There's so many great saints. What is it that united them? And I think much of that has to do with this exclusive and sort of privileged way of living spiritual fatherhood that has brought so much beautiful life into the world. And by making celibacy optional, we make that decision far more difficult for a young man who is discerning that charism, because it's a beautiful charism, but it's also a hard charism in some ways, and to recognize that and to say, like, if you say to a young man, well, you can become a priest now as a celibate, or go get married and come back and we'll ordain you anyway. I mean, I don't mean to sound glib about it, but for a young man, that's not going to be that hard a decision. Yeah. Whereas, I think it would be a hard decision for me back then, and yet I can't imagine a happier life and a more joyful life than the one that I feel like I'm the happiest man alive. But if they said, well, sure, you can go off and get married. I mean, I always plan to get married. So I think that those considerations need to be considered as well when we look at that option, the possibility of optional celibacy.
Father, I'd love to keep talking to you about celibacy forever because it is such a fascinating subject. And of course, it has for so long been a defining element of the Catholic priesthood, and also one of those elements of Catholic identity, something that makes us distinct from other offerings in the Christian panoply. And I just think there's a great deal to talk about there. But before we let you go, I also know that your vocation and your career in many ways is tied up with seminary life in the United States. And American seminaries have also come under a great deal of fire because of the sex abuse crisis. And there's this notion that there was something profoundly wrong with what was happening in seminaries, that somehow was responsible, or at least partly responsible, for this crisis. As you look at American seminaries today, what signs of change, renewal, hope, new life do you see there?
Great. Well, I think on two fronts primarily. First of all, I think it's very important that that the right men are admitted. That there are really good criteria for selection, and I think that has not always been the case. Not that they were all scoundrels admitted or anything like that, and there were a lot of wonderful people, good holy men who were in the seminary and became priests. But there simply wasn't much of a scrutiny in many respects, and I think especially as sort of family life started to kind of disintegrate in certain respects. So again, the sexual revolution, a lot of the cultural changes going on. There was a need for greater scrutiny that was not implemented until more recent times, in the last 25 years or something like that. I mean, just to put a number to it. And that includes a lot of references and psychologicals and all this kind of background stuff. So I think that's a very important aspect. And then within formation itself, I think that what St. John Paul II did in particular is put on the table the great need to not just have good spiritual formation, that's indisputable, but also good human formation. And I think a lot of that was taken for granted at a certain time in seminary formation, whereas now it needs to be much more studiously looked at. Is a man mature? Is a man able to have human affectivity? Is he able to have friendships? What is his life of chastity like? Is he able to live in peace, when he's alone, or how quickly does it, those sort of human issues, I think are very, very important, and we look at those far more carefully. I'm not saying that it's universal, because I don't think it is in every seminary, but I think virtually every seminary is certainly much better, but some have done more than others, and I think that's where the growth needs to continue to happen, and continue to hold our feet to the fire and really make sure that seminaries are doing a good job of that. But I personally, in my own experience, looking at these young guys coming in now, have been incredibly edified by the quality coming in, but also by their docility to have really serious, deep human formation. And I think that's been going on for a couple of decades now, it's sort of increasing the momentum. And so when you look at the sex abuse crisis and you see when these guys were ordained, there was a kind of a huge bubble, in a period of time when seminary formation, selection and formation was frankly not that great. Many good men were ordained anyway, but it wasn't that great. And I think we're doing a lot better now. And I think that is a source of hope and encouragement for us.
Well, this is sort of the story of the Catholic Church in miniature, isn't it? I mean, after more than 2,000 years, we are still a work in progress. But you're right. I think the miracle of it all is, despite whatever may be going on, whatever nuttiness may be happening in any given historical moment, the Church does still manage to generate, even in those moments, saints and incredibly holy people who do God's work in miraculous ways. We have been speaking to Father Carter Griffin. Father Griffin is the rector of the St. John Paul II Seminary in Washington, D.C. He is also the author of Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest, a new title from Emmaus Road Publishing. You're going to want to check that out. It is a terrific read. And particularly as we get closer to the big shindig in the Vatican this fall, the Synod for the Amazon, when clerical celibacy will be in the air, I would say that ought to be on your must-read list to gear up for that event. This is the kind of conversation you can find on the Crux website. It is your one-stop shopping destination for the best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. You can find us at cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. Father Carter Griffin, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
It's a great joy to be with you. Thanks, John.
Keep checking the Crux YouTube channel for these occasional video features. In the meantime, keep coming on the Crux site to read us every day. Thank you for watching, and until we meet again, have a fantastic and blessed summer. This is John Allen from Rome. See you soon.